It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. The streets were still half asleep, painted with the soft light of dawn. The air was cool, and the city had that calm that usually comes before the rush hour chaos. Two local police officers were on their regular patrol near the Federal District, the area surrounded by tall government buildings, security cameras, and guards who never smiled. It was supposed to be a slow day. No protests, no emergencies, no traffic jams yet, just another morning shift. The officers drove slowly, sipping coffee and chatting about weekend plans when something caught their attention. On the side of the road, right across from a restricted government building, stood a black Rolls-Royce. Now, in Washington, expensive cars aren't unusual, but this one was different. It looked new, spotless, polished to perfection, but parked in the wrong place. There was a sign just a few feet away that read, "No parking, Federal Zone, violators will be towed." The car had heavily tinted windows, darker than what was legally allowed. No license plate on the front. The rear plate looked official but strange, the kind that didn't show up often. The officers exchanged a look. Who in their right mind parks a Rolls-Royce here? One of them muttered. They decided to stop and take a closer look. When they stepped out of the patrol car, the street felt oddly quiet. No pedestrians, no nearby guards, just the hum of the wind through the alleyways. The Rolls-Royce sat there like a shadow, expensive, silent, and mysterious. They walked around it, checking every side. There was no parking permit, no identification tag, nothing. The engine was off, but the hood was still slightly warm, meaning someone had parked it recently. They tried to peer inside, but the windows were too dark. They couldn't see a thing. Not the seats, not even the steering wheel. It was as if someone had painted the glass black. One officer knocked gently on the driver's side window. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. They looked at each other again, the kind of look that says something's not right. After a few minutes, they decided to run the license plate through their system. The response came back instantly, but what they saw made them both frown. The system showed a restricted tag, meaning the record was locked. Normally they could see the owner's name, the car's details, registration date, but not this time. The system only said access denied, federal classification confidential. That's when the feeling of unease settled in. What does that even mean? One officer whispered. It means this car belongs to someone we shouldn't be dealing with, the other replied quietly. But there was still the problem. It was parked illegally, in a restricted area, and no one was around. They had to follow protocol. They called their supervisor to report the situation, but the call didn't go smoothly. The line kept cutting out, and the supervisor told them to hold position until further notice. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Still no one showed up. The officers started feeling uneasy. In their line of work, an unclaimed luxury car with no visible owner parked next to a government building was not something to take lightly. It could be anything, a stolen car, a setup, even a potential threat. Should we check inside? One of them finally asked. We can't just break a window on a car like this, the other replied. It could belong to someone important, or it could belong to someone dangerous, the first one shot back. They waited a few more minutes. Still nothing. No one came forward, no alarms went off, no messages from command. Just the sound of city life slowly waking up around them. Footsteps, traffic lights, distant horns. Finally, they decided to take a closer step. One of them leaned near the rear window and tried to see if there was anything suspicious inside. Maybe a briefcase, a device, something left on the seat, but the tint was too thick. That's when they noticed a faint ticking sound. It was probably just the car cooling off, but it was enough to send a chill down their spines. The officers stepped back instantly, exchanging another nervous glance. What if there's something inside? They had both been trained for this. If a vehicle in a sensitive zone appears suspicious and there's no owner, it could be a threat. The longer they waited, the greater the risk. One officer made the decision. He called in a quick update. Unattended vehicle, high value, restricted zone, no response from command. Taking precautionary entry. Then he picked up his baton and stood beside the driver's window. The other officer hesitated. You sure about this? He nodded. We can't risk waiting any longer. He gave one last warning shout toward the car. If anyone's inside, identify yourself now. Silence. He took a deep breath and swung. The baton hit the glass, and the sound exploded through the street, a sharp crack that shattered the calm morning air. The window splintered into a web of cracks, then broke inward with another strike. Tiny bits of glass fell to the ground like glittering rain. The officers stepped back, hearts pounding. They waited, expecting alarms to go off or someone to rush out, but nothing happened. The world stayed quiet. Cautiously, they leaned forward and peered inside. What they saw made them stop cold. The interior was spotless, almost unnaturally clean. The seats were covered in black leather, the dashboard gleamed, and a faint smell of expensive cologne filled the air. But what caught their eyes was a small silver briefcase on the passenger seat, stamped with a government emblem. Next to it was a thin tablet device showing a locked screen with an official-looking logo. There were also a few papers with red borders, the kind used for classified documents. The officer who broke the window swallowed hard. "Oh no, what did we just do?" He reached inside carefully and opened the glove compartment, hoping to find identification. Instead, he found an ID card with a gold emblem, the Central Intelligence Agency seal. He froze. His partner stared at the card, eyes wide. This belongs to the CIA?" They both stepped back from the car, panic starting to rise. The realization hit hard. They had just broken the window of a CIA vehicle. Not just any government car, but one clearly connected to high-level operations. The street suddenly didn't feel so empty anymore. A few pedestrians had stopped to look from a distance. Someone took out their phone, possibly recording. The officers quickly motioned for people to move along, trying to control the situation, but inside, they both felt the same cold dread. If this really was a CIA vehicle, that meant they had just committed a serious mistake. No one would care about their reasoning, their caution, or their protocol. All people would see was two local officers breaking into a car that wasn't theirs, and that car happened to belong to the most secretive agency in the country. The officer who made the decision to break the glass rubbed his forehead, his hands shaking slightly. "We're in trouble," he whispered. The other one tried to stay calm. "Let's not panic. Maybe we can explain. We followed procedure. Procedure doesn't save you from the CIA," his partner muttered. They stood there trying to figure out what to do next. Do they call it in again? Do they report what they found? Do they even mention the briefcase? Every possible move felt dangerous. And then, the sound of tires screeching. A black SUV turned the corner at high speed, followed by another one. Both unmarked. They pulled up within seconds, stopping just a few feet from the Rolls-Royce. Men in dark suits jumped out, fast, coordinated, and silent. The officers froze. Before they could even say a word, one of the men shouted, "Step away from the vehicle." Guns weren't drawn, but the tone left no room for argument. The officers raised their hands slightly and backed up. More agents surrounded the car, checking the interior, the damage, the briefcase. One of them pulled out a phone and made a quick call. Within a minute, the area was sealed off. The calm morning was gone, replaced by flashing lights, confusion, and tension thick enough to cut. The officers were separated, questioned on the spot, and their radios taken. They tried to explain what had happened. The suspicious car, the lack of response from command, the ticking sound, but no one seemed interested in listening yet. In that moment, they realized this was far from over. They hadn't just broken a car window. They had shattered their peace, their confidence, and possibly their careers, all in the span of a few seconds. And as the agents whispered among themselves, one phrase kept echoing in the officer's mind. What did we just get ourselves into? The two officers stood by the curb, hearts pounding as the dark-suited men surrounded the Rolls-Royce. What had started as a normal morning patrol had turned into something they could never have imagined. The scene looked like it had been pulled straight from a spy movie. The black SUVs that arrived seemed to appear out of thin air. The men who stepped out didn't speak much. They moved with purpose, fast and silent. One checked the car, another spoke quickly into a radio, and a third went straight to the officers. "Step over here," the man said firmly. His voice was calm but cold. The officers obeyed, moving to the side of the street. One of them tried to explain. "We were just doing our job." The car looked suspicious. No one responded. The agent cut him off. "You broke the window of a government vehicle." "We didn't know that," the other officer said quickly. "There were no signs, no ID. We called it in, but..." "Quiet," the agent said, glancing at them sharply. "Someone will talk to you soon." They exchanged a nervous look. There wasn't much else to say. The men around the car worked quickly. One photographed the broken glass, another collected small fragments in a bag, and a third carefully opened the briefcase that had been sitting on the passenger seat. The officers couldn't see what was inside, but the man who opened it froze for a second, then called another agent over. They spoke in low voices, too quiet to hear. The tension grew heavier with every passing minute. It felt like time had slowed down. The officers' police radios had been taken away, their phones too. They stood there, feeling smaller and smaller, watching as these serious-looking people took control of everything. A few minutes later, one of the SUV's doors opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit like the others, just a dark coat and glasses. He looked calm, maybe even too calm, like someone who had seen far worse things than a broken window. The agent straightened the moment he arrived. The tall man walked up slowly, looked at the Rolls-Royce, then turned to the two officers. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at them. His eyes weren't angry, but they weren't friendly either. They were sharp, observant, the kind of eyes that could read everything without a single question. Then finally he asked in a quiet voice, "Which one of you broke the window?" The officer on the right hesitated, then raised his hand. "I did, sir." The tall man nodded slowly. "Why?" There was no identification. The car was in a restricted zone. "We tried calling our command, but no one answered. We thought it could be dangerous." The man listened without interrupting. He looked back at the car, then at the agent who had opened the briefcase. That agent gave him a quick nod as if confirming something. "Dangerous," the man repeated softly as if tasting the word. Then he sighed. "You're not wrong." That sentence surprised both officers. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You did what you were trained to do. You followed protocol, but unfortunately that car is not something you should have touched." Before they could respond, he gestured for one of the agents to bring something over. The agent handed him a small folder. He opened it and flipped through a few pages, then looked back at the officers. "I need your full names and badge numbers," he said. They gave them immediately. He wrote them down in the folder, then closed it and said quietly, "You'll be hearing from your department later. For now, you'll stay here until we finish." The officers nodded nervously. The man turned to the agents again. "Clean up the area. No photos leave the street. Make sure all recordings are collected." The men moved instantly. They confiscated a few bystanders' phones, giving them official cards in return. "Evidence collection," they said. Within minutes, the whole street looked like it had never happened. But for the two officers, every second felt like an hour. They whispered to each other when no one was close. "What do you think's in that briefcase?" one asked quietly. "Whatever it is, we shouldn't know," the other replied. "This is way above us." The tall man was now talking quietly to someone over his phone. His expression changed slightly as he listened, from calm to serious, then to something close to concern. He nodded a few times, said "understood," and hung up. Then he turned back to the officers. "Your actions this morning," he said, "will need to be reviewed. But I'll tell you this much. You probably just saved us from a much bigger problem." Both officers blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. He looked at the broken glass again. "That vehicle shouldn't have been here. It wasn't supposed to be out at all." He paused. "Someone moved it without authorization. You may have stopped something we didn't even know was happening." The words didn't make full sense to them, but it felt like a small weight lifted off their shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, they hadn't completely ruined their lives. Still, the fear didn't go away. The agents finished their work, taped off the car, and began to tow it away. The tall man told the officers they were free to go, but warned them not to discuss anything they'd seen. Not with their department, not with friends, not even with family. They nodded again, still stunned. As they walked back to their patrol car, the world seemed quieter than before. The morning sun had risen, casting long shadows down the street. Traffic was beginning to pick up. Life around them looked normal again, but nothing felt normal. When they got back in their car, neither spoke for several minutes. The hum of the engine filled the silence. Finally, one of them said softly, "Do you think we're in trouble?" "I don't know," the other replied. "Maybe, maybe not. But I think we did the right thing." They both sat there for a moment, replaying everything in their heads. The mysterious car, the broken glass, the silent agents, and that calm man who seemed to know everything. The officer who had broken the window leaned his head against the seat. "I can't believe this is happening. Of all the cars in the city, we had to find that one." His partner gave a small laugh, but it didn't sound happy. "Yeah, we should buy a lottery ticket." They drove off slowly, heading back toward the station. Neither of them noticed the unmarked car that started following them a few blocks away. Later that afternoon, both officers were called into their chief's office. He looked tense more than usual. The blinds were closed, and there were two men in suits waiting inside, the same style as the agents from earlier. The chief motioned for them to sit. "What happened this morning?" he asked. They started explaining everything from the beginning, how they saw the car, how no one responded, how they followed procedure. The men in suits listened without expression. When the story ended, one of them simply said, "That will be all for now." The chief gave them a long, tired look. "You both did your jobs," he said finally, "but for now this incident is classified. You are not to discuss it outside this office." They nodded again. When they left the room, the weight of the morning hit them all over again. It felt unreal, like a dream that refused to fade. That night, neither of them slept well. One kept thinking about the tall man, his calm voice, his sharp eyes, the strange relief in his tone when he said they might have stopped something bigger. The other kept thinking about the briefcase. What could have been inside it? Why did it make those agents so serious? But the biggest question of all was the same for both. Who exactly was that tall man? The next morning, before they could even start their shift, they received a notice. They were to report to a federal building downtown for further clarification. When they arrived, the same tall man was waiting. He greeted them politely, offered them coffee, and said, "I know you've had a stressful day, but I think it's time you know the truth about what you found." The two officers exchanged a look, unsure if they even wanted to know. The man smiled faintly and continued, "That car, the Rolls-Royce, always belongs to someone very important, someone whose name never appears in public. The reason it was there, well, let's just say it wasn't supposed to be." He paused for a moment, studying their reactions. "What you found inside," he continued, "wasn't dangerous, but it was valuable, in ways most people can't imagine." He leaned back in his chair. "You did the right thing. You saw something unusual and acted. That's rare these days." The officers didn't know how to respond. Part of them felt relief. Another part felt fear. The man stood up and said quietly, "For now, go back to your normal duties. But understand this, what happened yesterday didn't go unnoticed. You may hear from us again." They nodded silently. As they left the building, one of them whispered, "Who do you think he really is?" The other shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever's going on, we're already part of it." And they were right, because what they didn't know was that the man they'd spoken to wasn't just any official. He was the director of the CIA himself. And this was only the beginning. The day after their meeting at the federal building, the two officers returned to their regular patrol. Or at least, that's what they tried to tell themselves. But everything felt different now. Every siren, every radio call, every black car passing by made them uneasy. They didn't talk much that morning. The silence between them said enough. Both were trying to process what had happened, and what they'd been told. The mysterious man, the Rolls-Royce, the strange case inside it, and the quiet warning that they might hear from him again. Nothing about it felt finished. The city was alive again. Busy streets, people rushing to work, buses honking, and coffee shops full. But for the two officers, it all felt distant, as if they were watching from behind glass. At one point, one of them broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" His partner shook his head slowly. "No, not with people like that involved." He was right. Later that afternoon, their police chief called them into his office again. His face looked serious but not angry. The blinds were drawn and the room felt heavy. "There's been some follow-up from yesterday's situation," the chief said, folding his hands on the desk. "The federal agency involved wants to meet you both again. They said it's not disciplinary, more like an internal clarification." The two officers exchanged uneasy looks. They had thought the last meeting was the end of it. "Apparently not. When?" one of them asked quietly. "In 1 hour," the chief replied. "You'll be escorted. An hour later, another black SUV arrived outside the precinct. The same kind of vehicle they had seen at the scene of the Rolls-Royce. Two men in suits stepped out and opened the back doors. No words, just a small gesture to get in. The drive was silent. The city slipped by street, until they entered a quieter part of downtown, a place filled with tall, glass-covered buildings that didn't have signs or names. The SUV stopped in front of one of them. The officers were led inside through a security checkpoint where their badges, phones, and even pens were taken. They were then escorted into an elevator that went down, not up. The elevator ride felt endless. The air got cooler, the sound muffled. When the doors finally opened, they stepped into a long hallway lined with metal doors and dim lights. At the end of the hall was a glass room. Inside, sitting at a sleek table, was the same tall man from before. He greeted them with a nod. "Good afternoon, officers," they both replied nervously. "Good afternoon, sir." He gestured toward the chairs across from him. "Please sit." Once they sat down, he studied them for a moment before speaking. "I understand you've had a few sleepless nights." They both gave small, uneasy smiles. "I can't blame you," he continued. "Most people wouldn't know how to handle what you stumbled upon." He leaned back slightly, his tone calm but focused. "You already know the car you found belongs to our agency. What you don't know is why it was there." The room went quiet. He looked at the table for a second, then back at them. That vehicle was part of an ongoing investigation. It was never supposed to be in that area. It was supposed to be in a secure garage. Someone moved it without authorization, and we didn't know until your report came in. "So, someone from your own agency?" one officer asked carefully. "Yes," the man said simply. "We have an internal problem, and you by accident exposed it." That sentence hung in the air like fog. He continued, "You may have prevented a serious security breach. That's the reason I wanted to see you again, to thank you properly and to clear up what really happened." One of the officers spoke softly. "We thought we were in trouble." The man gave a faint smile. "You were for about 5 minutes." Then his expression turned serious again. "But once we saw what you'd done, how carefully you followed your instincts, we realized you may have saved us from something much worse." The officers sat quietly, unsure how to respond. The man leaned forward slightly. "You followed training, not fear. That's rare. Most people hesitate when they think they might upset someone powerful. You didn't. You saw something wrong and acted." For a moment, there was silence again. Then one officer asked, "So what happens now?" The man folded his hands. "Now we fix what was broken, and we make sure no one else makes the same mistake, including us." He stood up and walked toward the glass wall, looking out into the hallway. "The truth is," he said quietly, "that Rolls-Royce wasn't just a car. It's used by the director himself." The officers froze. They hadn't expected that. "The director of the CIA?" one asked slowly. "Yes," the man said without turning around. "He's currently out of the country. That vehicle was under his security team's control. Someone on that team moved it without clearance, probably for personal reasons. But when you broke that window, it set off alarms inside this building. Not literal ones, but bureaucratic ones. It forced us to check everything." He turned around and looked at them again, and that's when we found the real problem. "What problem?" one of the officers asked. The man didn't answer directly. He just said, let's just say your timing was remarkable." The two officers looked at each other, unsure what that meant. The man gave a small, knowing smile. "You won't hear about this on the news. No one will. But I wanted you to know what you did was right." He then handed each of them a small sealed envelope. "Inside there's a letter of commendation. It won't be public, but it's official." The officers looked down at the envelopes, still unsure if they should even open them. Before they could ask anything more, the man said softly, "One more thing. The director himself knows about you two. When he returns, he'll want to meet you personally." They both sat still, eyes wide. "The director wants to meet us?" one asked in disbelief. The man nodded. "He respects people who act with courage. He may not show it, but he does." The meeting ended shortly after. The agents escorted them back to the elevator and then out of the building. The drive back to the station felt surreal. Neither spoke the entire way. When they finally returned, the chief asked no questions. He simply nodded and told them to take the rest of the day off. That night, the officer who broke the window couldn't sleep again. He kept thinking about what the man said, that the director himself knew about them. He imagined what kind of person the director might be. Powerful, distant, maybe strict. The kind of man who didn't take mistakes lightly. But what he didn't know was that the director wasn't angry. In fact, miles away, inside a secure overseas facility, the director had already been briefed. He read the report about the incident carefully, every word, every detail. When he reached the part where it described the officer's decision to break the window, he paused. Then he smiled faintly. "Good," he said quietly to his assistant. "At least someone out there still follows instinct." His assistant looked surprised. "Sir, they caused quite a stir." "Yes," the director replied, "but they also prevented one." He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Have them monitored for now. And when I return, schedule a meeting." Back in Washington, days passed slowly. The two officers went back to regular patrols, but they were different now. More alert, more thoughtful. They had seen how thin the line was between ordinary duty and extraordinary consequence. Sometimes, when they passed by that same government building, they'd glance at the spot where the Rolls-Royce had been. It was empty now, just another parking zone. But it always brought back that morning, the sound of breaking glass, the rush of fear, and the feeling that the world had suddenly become bigger and stranger. A week later, an unmarked envelope arrived at their precinct. Inside was a short note typed on thick paper. "The director has returned. You will be contacted soon." There was no signature, no name, just the official seal embossed, in gold at the bottom. The officers looked at each other in silence. It was clear now, this story wasn't over, and neither of them had any idea what kind of meeting was waiting for them next.
The morning was gray and quiet when the message came. The two officers were sitting in their patrol car, parked by the river, drinking coffee in silence. It had been almost a week since that envelope arrived, the one that said the director had returned. They had tried to go back to normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every day since then had felt like waiting. Waiting for a call, a visit, something. That morning, the waiting finally ended. The radio crackled. The chief's voice came through, calm but firm. "Both of you, report to headquarters immediately. You have a scheduled meeting downtown. Federal escort will arrive in 15 minutes. The two officers looked at each other. They didn't even need to speak. They both knew who the meeting was with. When the black SUVs pulled up outside the station, the air felt heavier than usual. The men in suits didn't say much. One of them simply nodded toward the back seat. "He's waiting." They climbed in slowly, unsure what to expect. The car pulled away smoothly, the sound of the city fading behind them. Neither of them said a word during the ride. They just stared out the window, each lost in their thoughts. After about 20 minutes, they arrived at a tall glass building in a quiet part of town. No signs, no visible name. Just tinted doors and security cameras that followed every movement. Inside, they were led through a metal detector and a long hallway. The walls were lined with photographs of old intelligence operations, moments in history that had shaped the world but were never told in full. Then, the agents stopped in front of a door. One of them said quietly, "He'll see you now." The door opened and the two officers stepped inside. The room wasn't large or fancy. It had a single long table, 2 chairs on one side, and a man sitting alone on the other. He was older than they expected, with gray hair and sharp eyes. His expression was calm, not harsh, not friendly, but deeply observant. He looked like someone who carried the weight of 1,000 secrets, yet stayed perfectly composed. He didn't speak right away. He just studied them, as if he already knew everything about them. Finally, he said, "Sit down." They obeyed. For a few seconds, the room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. Then the man leaned forward slightly. "So," he said slowly, "you're the two who broke the window of my car." The officers froze. They had known the car belonged to the CIA director, but hearing it directly from him made their hearts pound faster. The director smiled faintly when he saw their nervous faces. "Relax, you're not in trouble." One of them finally spoke. "Sir, we didn't know it was yours. We thought—" He raised his hand gently. I know what you thought. That's what I want to talk about. He leaned back, his voice calm. You saw something suspicious. You didn't wait for orders. You didn't ignore it because it looked expensive or because you were afraid of authority. You acted. That's exactly what I expect from people who protect others. They both stayed quiet, not sure if they should respond. The director continued. That car should never have been there. It was moved without authorization. The person responsible is being dealt with. But what matters now is how you handled it. He opened a folder on the table. Inside were printed reports, photos from the scene, written statements, even a transcript of their first radio call. He turned one of the pages and said softly, You followed procedure perfectly. You didn't overreact. You didn't take shortcuts. That's rare these days. One of the officers finally found the courage to speak. We honestly thought it might be a threat, sir. The car was parked illegally. The windows were too dark. We called it in, but no one responded. The director nodded slowly. You trusted your training over your fear. I respect that. He closed the folder and placed his hands flat on the table. When I heard what happened, I was angry at first. I won't lie about that. But then I read your report, and I realized that anger was pride getting in the way of reason. You did what you were supposed to do. And that's something even people at the top need to remember. The words took the officers by surprise. They had expected blame or at least some formal warning. Instead, they were being thanked. The director studied their faces again. Tell me something, he said suddenly. What was going through your mind when you decided to break that window? The officer who had done it swallowed hard. Honestly, sir, I was scared. But I was more scared of what could happen if I didn't. If there was something inside that car that could hurt someone. I couldn't just stand there. The director nodded thoughtfully. That fear, that's what keeps people alive. Not the fear of authority, but the fear of doing nothing when something might go wrong. He paused, then said quietly, You remind me of someone I used to work with. He once said, protocol over pride. That's how he lived his whole career. The officer's partner glanced at him, realizing those were the same words the director had said the day of the incident. The director looked down for a moment, almost smiling at the memory. I said that years ago, he admitted, and it seems I needed to hear it again, from your actions. He stood up, walked to a small cabinet, and poured 3 cups of coffee. He handed one to each officer, his tone softening. You know, people think power comes from control, but real power comes from humility, from knowing when to admit that someone else did the right thing. They sipped quietly, not sure how to respond. After a moment, one of them asked carefully, Sir, if we may. What was inside that car? The director chuckled lightly. Curious, are we? He shook his head. Nothing dangerous. Just a few very confidential files that were supposed to be transferred safely. The car was taken without permission. The person who did it thought he could handle something privately. He was wrong. He took another sip of coffee. Your timing stopped him from making a bigger mistake. The officers both exhaled softly. They hadn't realized how tense they'd been until that moment. The director looked at them again. You two are good officers. Keep doing your jobs the same way. The world needs more people like you. People who act when something doesn't feel right. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 small cards, placing them on the table. If you ever need help, any kind of help, call this number. Don't use your department lines. Just call directly. Someone will answer. They looked down. The cards had no name, no logo, just a number printed in plain black text. They nodded slowly. Thank you, sir. The director gave a small nod. No, thank you. He extended his hand to each of them. They shook it, still a little stunned. Then he said quietly, You can tell your chief that everything has been settled. No paperwork, no reports. This stays off the record. They both agreed. As they stood to leave, the director stopped them one last time. One more thing, he said. Don't ever doubt your instincts. They're what make you human. And in this world, humanity is worth more than any title. The words lingered with them as they walked out. Outside, the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. The tension that had followed them for days finally began to fade. In the SUV ride back, one of them looked out the window and said softly, "He wasn't what I expected." His partner nodded. "Yeah, me neither. I thought he'd be cold. But he seemed kind. Kind and scary at the same time," the first officer said with a small laugh. They both smiled, feeling a strange mix of relief and awe. When they returned to the station, the chief asked how it went. They simply said, "It went well." That night, for the first time in weeks, they both slept soundly. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, a quiet buzz spread through the precinct. A letter had arrived addressed to the police department from the CIA headquarters. It was brief, official, and to the point. It read, "The agency acknowledges the professionalism and courage displayed by officers, names redacted, during an unexpected security event. Their actions exemplified sound judgment and integrity under uncertain conditions. Please extend our gratitude." The letter was signed, Director, Central Intelligence Agency. The chief read it twice before calling them into his office. He didn't say much, just handed them the letter and said, "You two have made us proud." For a long moment, they just stood there, looking at the signature at the bottom of the page. The director hadn't just forgiven them, he had honored them. As they walked out of the office, they both felt something they hadn't felt in weeks: peace. And neither of them knew it yet. But that one small act, breaking a window out of duty, had started a quiet ripple inside one of the most powerful agencies in the world. A ripple that would soon reach much farther than either of them could imagine.
The sun was just rising when the two officers arrived at the station the next morning. The air smelled like rain and coffee, and the world seemed calmer than it had in a long time. They parked the patrol car, still half expecting someone to pull them aside with new orders, new questions, or another round of explanations. But the station was quiet. They walked inside, greeted by a few curious looks. Word had spread about the letter from the CIA. People whispered, smiled, and gave them nods of respect. It felt strange. Just a few days ago, they had been worried about losing their jobs. Now, the same people who avoided eye contact were suddenly treating them like heroes. But they didn't feel like heroes. They had just done their jobs. The chief called them into his office. His usual serious expression was softer this time. He held up the official letter from the CIA and said, "You two made history in a way none of us expected. This department has never received something like this before." They both stood quietly, unsure what to say. The chief leaned back in his chair. "I'm proud of you. And I'm sure you've both learned that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it always matters." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "You can take the rest of the week off. You've earned it." They thanked him and left the office, still processing everything. Outside, one of them finally said, "I can't believe it's over." His partner replied, "Yeah, but something tells me it's not really over." And he was right. Later that afternoon, while one of the officers was home sitting on his porch, he got a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm and steady. "Good afternoon. This is the director." For a second, he didn't know what to say. "Sir, I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know," the director said. "I just wanted to speak to you personally. I couldn't say everything I wanted to during our meeting." The officer straightened up, his heart beating faster. "Of course, sir," the director continued. "You probably don't realize how much that one decision meant. Not just to your department, but to people like me. I've spent decades around power, secrets, and politics. It changes how you see the world. But what you did reminded me of something I had forgotten, that people still act from simple, honest duty. That still matters." There was a short silence. The officer could hear faint city noise on the other end of the call. The director spoke again, softer this time. "You see, when you reach a certain level, everyone around you starts treating you differently. They stop questioning you. They stop challenging you. And that's dangerous. You didn't hesitate to question what you saw. You didn't let the idea of rank stop you from doing your job. That's courage, even if it doesn't feel like it." The officer didn't know how to respond. He just said quietly, "Thank you, sir. We only wanted to keep people safe." "I know," said the director, "and that's why I wanted to call. I wanted to say thank you myself, not as the director, but as a person. You may not realize it, but you reminded a lot of people in this building what real service looks like." The officer smiled faintly. "That means a lot, sir." There was another small pause. Then the director said, "You told me you were scared that day. You were right to be. Fear isn't weakness. It's what reminds us we're still human. And that's something too many people forget in this line of work." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the director said, "You should get some rest. You've done more good than you know. Take care of yourself." The call ended. The officer sat there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of traffic in the distance. The sky had turned golden, and for the first time in weeks his mind felt clear. The next day he met his partner at a small diner near the edge of town. They ordered breakfast, sat by the window, and talked about everything that had happened. "I got a call from him," the officer said. His partner looked up. "The director?" He nodded. "Yeah, he thanked us again." His partner let out a small laugh. "That's unbelievable. You think anyone would believe this if we told them?" "Probably not," the officer replied with a grin. "It sounds like something out of a movie." They both laughed quietly, and for a moment it felt like old times again. Just two people doing their jobs, talking about life. But underneath the laughter was something deeper, a quiet understanding that they'd been changed by what had happened. Over the next few weeks, things slowly went back to normal at the precinct. The calls, the reports, the long shifts, everything carried on like before. But people treated them differently now. New recruits looked up to them. Even the chief asked for their opinions during briefings. One afternoon, they were invited to speak at a local police academy. The topic was decision-making under pressure. They weren't sure why they had been chosen, but they agreed to go. When they arrived, the room was filled with young cadets, eager and nervous, notebooks in hand. One of the officers stepped up to the front of the room and said, "You're all learning the rules, and that's good. But one day you'll face something that isn't in the manual, something that doesn't make sense. And in that moment, what matters most isn't fear or hesitation, but it's your instinct. Trust it. That's what keeps people safe," his partner added. "And don't let rank or titles blind you. The world doesn't care how powerful someone is. If something looks wrong, it probably is. Never forget why you wear that badge, and it's not for power, it's for protection." The cadets listened quietly, taking notes. Some of them smiled. Others nodded slowly, as if those words would stay with them for a long time. Afterward, one of the young recruits approached and said, "Sir, do you ever regret it? Breaking that window?" The officer smiled. Not for a second, because that sound and that crash meant someone cared enough to act. The recruit looked thoughtful, then said, "I hope I can be that brave someday." The officer put a hand on his shoulder. "You will be. Just remember, courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what's right even when you are." That conversation spread quietly among the cadets, and soon the story of the broken window became part of their training stories. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson about integrity. Weeks turned into months. Life moved on. But one afternoon, as the officer was getting ready to head home, he found a small envelope in his locker. It had no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note. "There are moments that remind us why we serve. You created one of them. Thank you." It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The same careful script from the director's first letter. He folded the note gently and placed it in his wallet. He never told anyone about it, not even his partner. Some things were better left as quiet reminders. That evening, he sat in his car and thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the confusion, the unexpected kindness. He realized something important. Doing the right thing didn't always bring applause or headlines. Sometimes it just brought peace, and that peace was enough. The next day, when he met his partner again for another long shift, they didn't talk about the past. They just shared a nod, the kind of silent understanding that didn't need words. They knew what they had done, and they knew what it meant. In the world of flashing lights, noise, and endless decisions, they had found something rare, a moment of truth. And even though the glass of that Rolls-Royce had long been replaced, its shatter still echoed quietly in their minds, not as a mistake, but as a reminder that courage doesn't come from knowing the outcome. It comes from acting when no one else will. and in the eyes of those who understood, that was worth more than any award. Weeks passed and the city went back to its usual rhythm. Sirens came and went. People hurried through their lives, and the story of the broken Rolls-Royce window began to fade from the headlines. But inside police stations and federal offices, the story quietly lived on. It started with a few conversations. An officer in another district mentioned it during briefing. Someone shared the official letter from the CIA, and soon people across the country were talking about the two officers who broke the director's window. What surprised everyone wasn't the act itself, but how it ended. No punishments, no anger, just understanding. Within a month, the story was being told at training seminars and police gatherings. It became an example of what real judgment looked like under pressure. Some people called it the window lesson. Others just said, remember the Rolls-Royce story. For the two officers, life stayed ordinary. They kept working their shifts, answering calls, dealing with the usual mix of small crimes and emergencies. But sometimes when they walked into a new precinct or training event, people recognized them. They would smile, shake their hands, and say things like, "You did the right thing," or "You reminded us why we started this job." At first, the attention felt strange. They weren't used to praise. They didn't think they had done anything extraordinary. But over time, they realized that maybe people just needed stories like this. Real moments that proved honesty and courage still existed in a world full of fear and bureaucracy. One afternoon, the chief called them into his office again. He held up a letter, another one from Washington. It was shorter this time, but the message was clear. Following the recent review, the director has recommended commendation for outstanding duty and professional integrity. There were no medals, no ceremonies, just quiet recognition, and that was exactly how they wanted it. That evening, they went for a walk downtown. The air was cool, and the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. The younger officer kicked at a small stone and said, "You ever think about how weird this all is? How something so small turned into this?" His partner smiled. "Yeah, I think about it a lot. But maybe that's how things change, not with big speeches or fancy plans, but with simple actions that come from the right place." They stopped by the same street where everything had started, the spot where the black Rolls-Royce had been parked that morning months ago. The glass had long been cleaned up, and the parking space now had a sign that read "Government Vehicles Only." For a moment, they just stood there in silence. The younger officer said quietly, "You ever wonder if he comes by here sometimes?" His partner looked at the building across the street and nodded. Maybe. People like him don't forget things like this. He was right. A few weeks later, the director stood in his office late at night, looking out over the city lights. He held a thin file in his hand, the report about the incident, now stamped closed. But instead of putting it away, he slipped it into a small box on his desk labeled "Reminders." Inside were old notes, photographs, and a few items from his years of service, moments that had shaped him. He placed the file on top and closed the box gently. Then he picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Send a memo to the internal training department," he said. "Add a new section to the ethics module, real-world decision-making. Title it Henley's Window." The assistant hesitated. "Henley's Window, sir?" The director smiled faintly. "Yes, it's about humility, instinct, and knowing when to put duty over pride. Make sure it's shared across all agencies." The next morning, that memo began its quiet journey through official channels. Within weeks, Henley's Window became a short case study used in government training sessions. It described how two patrol officers followed instinct and procedure when faced with uncertainty, and how leadership responded with empathy instead of punishment. The story reached people in ways no lecture ever could. It showed that mistakes didn't always need blame, and authority didn't always need to shout. Sometimes understanding was stronger. Months later, one of the officers was invited to attend a national law enforcement conference. He wasn't there to speak, just to listen and learn. But during a session about ethics, a speaker told a story that began with familiar words. "You may have heard about the officers who broke the window of a Rolls-Royce outside a government building." The officer sat quietly in the audience, listening as the speaker described the event from start to finish. The speaker didn't know the officer was in the room. He simply ended the talk by saying, "And that's why courage and humility must always work together." That's what keeps the system human. The room erupted in applause. The officer smiled to himself, feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief. He didn't say anything to anyone afterward. He just walked outside, looked at the sky, and took a deep breath. That night, when he got home, he wrote a few lines in a small notebook he kept for personal thoughts. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest cracks. We broke a window, but maybe we opened a door. He closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and turned off the light. Years later, after both officers had retired, the story was still being told. It had become part of official training in several states. Some instructors used it to teach judgment under pressure. Others used it to talk about leadership, responsibility, and empathy. In one classroom, a young recruit asked, "Do you think that story's real?" The instructor smiled. "Every bit of it." The recruit nodded slowly, inspired. "Then I want to be that kind of officer." And that was how the story lived on. Not through medals or awards, but through quiet influence. Meanwhile, the director himself eventually retired. On his last day in office, he cleared his desk and looked around the empty room. He paused for a moment, then opened the reminders box one last time. The file labeled Henley's window was still there. He smiled softly and said to himself, "Still one of the best lessons I ever learned." Then he closed the lid, left the office, and walked out into the sunlight. Somewhere across the city, the two officers, older now with grayer hair and calmer hearts, sat at the same diner where they'd met after everything had happened. They talked about their families, their work, and how strange it was that one morning's decision had followed them for so long. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" one asked. His partner thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No. It reminded me that doing the right thing isn't about knowing what will happen next. It's about doing what you'd hope someone else would do if they were in your place." They finished their coffee, left a few dollars on the counter, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city around them buzzed with life, sirens in the distance, people laughing on sidewalks, lights flickering in tall buildings. It all looked the same as it always had, but they knew they would never see it quite the same way again. As they walked away, one of them turned and glanced at the skyline. Somewhere up there, maybe in a high office window, the director was looking down at the same city, remembering, just as they were. The broken glass had long been swept away, but the memory of that morning would never disappear. It had become a story that outlived the people who started it, a quiet testament to integrity, courage, and the rare moments when humanity triumphs over pride. And in every police academy where the lesson was taught, one line always stood out on the final slide: Henley's window. When doing the right thing breaks the silence, not just the glass, the story always ended there, followed by a long pause. And somewhere in every class, at least one young officer would smile, inspired by a story that began with fear, ended with understanding, and reminded the world that kindness can come from the highest places, even when it starts with a single broken window.